interesting material, and I confess that this is far afield from anything that I have any expertise in. So feel free to dismiss the speculations easily. I'm drawing here on ideas from Jason Clark, who visited us last year. So you presented in your blue tinted model two possibilities, right? One was massive modularity, and the other was essentially a number of subordinate systems that share a fundamental causal reasoning massive mechanism, right? There's a third possibility, which potentially might give leverage for answering your fourth question there, and that is that there is this is a case of serial homology, okay, where you have a duplication with modification of a mechanism. Okay, now you might say, well, if that were true, then we wouldn't get these deficit patterns that we get, where individuals who are poor at causal reasoning are also poor at theory of mind. But you would if it was, and this is also Jason's idea, if it was a developmental serial homology. So one has to come first, it has to get duplicated and modified to make the second one. And at least if you phrase for in ontogenetic terms rather than phylogenetic terms, that's potentially answerable that way. If you suspect that there are constraints on optimality such that the features that were originally selected for are deep in the mechanism and therefore likely to be present in the serial homologies, even though they're not functional in those, then you can answer the phylogeny question, if that's true. Now, it may not be true, but it often is true. Certainly in emotions, it seems to be true a lot. So then the question becomes, well, how do you test between those possibilities? And one is looking at ontogeny, and the other is looking for that phylogenetic legacy, right? So you speculate which of these might be the first one. And arguably, I think a good case could be made that understanding causal relationships in the physical world is primordial relative to understanding causal relationships in the social world. And therefore, if there are things that are unique to the physical world, understanding those causal relationships that don't necessarily apply, you should see people treating inappropriately aspects of causal reasoning in the social world as if they had physical-like properties.
I completely agree. So when I give this talk and just focus on architecture, I have a whole slide on that. I think it's an entirely plausible hypothesis, and that we should not get stuck thinking that the module is a physical thing. Right? The one thing I would add, or not differ, but a different emphasis, is I use that typically when I'm talking to these folks. But I say, I think these folks are the ones that can solve that problem. Because if it does turn out that you, but again, do this for ethical reasons, you knock out the lateral PFC, and everything else falls apart. And then we've got some really strong evidence that, in fact, it's not duplicated. It's actually a singular. On the other hand, if these guys end up having really strong evidence that the medial and lateral are independent of each other, you can knock out one and out the other. So what I tend to say in talks like this is, I just wish the philosophers would get out of the room, and these guys can actually solve it. It's because it's not a philosophical problem anymore. It's a problem that we can actually solve empirically with that kind of research. And I think they're on the cusp. I think like in 10 years, they'll have that sorted out, and then there'll be an answer, and then we won't be speculating about whether it's a one mechanism or multiple mechanisms. Otherwise, today it's completely different. We don't have for sure.
I think if you go that route, and you're focusing on the prefrontal cortex, you ought to include the ventromedial and orbitofrontal, which are underneath it, and are important and also to emotional reasoning and social cognition. To try to discount those areas which are phylogenetically very late and characteristic of humans, I think you're trying to build a cognitive machine that won't work.
I understand the point. Yeah, I don't necessarily have an iron in that fire in a sense. I think I would love to just encourage folks that are doing that kind of research, which is not research, to take into account these kinds of human, non-human questions when they're asking these questions. I think those things can be resolved empirically. I don't think that it needs to be a speculative question. I agree. It could. It's not about the candidates, as you probably know. And there's lots of, not everybody agrees with the PFC, so it's not at all a finalized debate.
So the two alternatives that you suggested, the massive modularity one and then the domain general add-on theory, the difficulty, I think, is that, and this is following a little bit on what Dan said, if modules or specialized brain regions develop from previously existing ones, and they inherit aspects of their architecture and design, then empirically it can be almost impossible to tell the difference between, let's say, a system of 10 modules, I'm making up numbers here, right? All of which have common structural features, like maybe they're Bayesian, like Bayesian updating procedures, right?
Yep.
Maybe they all have some elements of causal inference in them, right? So to apply to their domain, be it spatial navigation or tool use, or if they have shared elements, then it can be difficult to tease that apart from the view that there's just a single system that implements all those things, which is a problem for all of us in trying to test between these hypotheses. And what I think is particularly difficult is, in this case, when in causal reasoning, and I don't have all the evidence at my fingertips, but there's an incredible amount of domain specificity in human causal reasoning. All of the phenomena that you mentioned, including things like curiosity, tinkering with the world to find out what's happening. I work with some people that are in the category that you characterize as roughly sort of pre-high-tech society, right? That they make all their own stuff. And you see curiosity in some places. You see the kinds of things that you've suggested, incredible ingenuity in figuring out cause and effect relationships for catching animals and things like that. You see other areas where there's absolutely zero curiosity whatsoever. And not only that, you can show them a better way of doing it, and they won't do it. So that's just one example. But to me, when I look at that, I see incredible amounts of domain specificity. So it looks to me equally plausible that you can have something like there's a system that has to do with using tools and things that you can manipulate with your hands, right? Along the lines of you're saying that chimps have an island of competence with respect to using sticks to grab bananas. Humans too have areas where we're really clever about it, and then we have vast other areas where it's terrible. And things like science. I mean, the idea that a baby is a scientist, I don't think that's true in a domain general way. It might be true in a very domain specific way, that in figuring out how this Lego goes onto this other Lego, they'll entertain some hypotheses and explore the hypothesis space. But modern science wasn't invented until quite recently and required a lot of human cultural evolution in order to get to the procedures that we use. So all the things that you mentioned, like I do the control condition, I think there's a lot of cases where people don't do the control condition. They never find out what happens if we don't do the rain dance, right? And so they never do the appropriate intervention to find out if it works. Anyway, all this is by way of saying I think it's an interesting hypothesis, but I don't think the parsimony view, which is kind of what you were implying, like the multiple modules thing, we should knock that out because it's not parsimonious, compared to the view that we just have one general system. When you get to a case where, in order to explain the general purpose system, we have to postulate a whole bunch of islands of domain specificity within it. The hypotheses now are not in exact, one is not winning that parsimony game compared to the other one. And so it's going to be difficult to empirically tease apart these options.
I think the most important thing, the first point I would want to make, well, 2 points. One, it's clear human culture has exacerbated whatever, all those effects you talk about. That's very clear. But you look at the kind of experience, I'm not familiar with Laura Schultz and those people in non-Western preschoolers, but I think that would be fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Absolutely.
Someone should get her down there, right?
We're working on it.
Good, excellent. Then to your philosophical point, I think it's very important that I'm not, well, actually more generally, I think there's a problem when the debates become between a pure domain general blank slate system and a pure massively modular domain. I don't think anyone's arguing for either one of those anymore, right? Yeah. So the question is, what's the balance between the two, right? And I'm probably proposing a little bit, I'm proposing on evolutionary grounds and on computational grounds because there are some operations going on underneath the hood that look like they're pretty similar in analogous. But your point is absolutely right, then. I mean, it's possible that there's one system that's doing it. That's why it's on there as my question, number 5. What's possible is that whatever gene mechanisms and neural mechanisms did that got replicated in a bunch of different places. And we don't know. And that's a question that's empirically verifiable, and we have the tools to do it. So, like, I do think it's a neuroscience question, not so much as a psychology question. Because I'm not taking a position on that. But I do think you look at the commonalities across these different domains, and there's so many commonalities in terms of some of the computational operations. And so that suggests that somehow those innovations occurred not separately each time, right? And that's just a suggestion. I'm very aware of the fact that speculative until somebody irons out the differences. And then I want to make another point about animals, which I think is interesting, is that I didn't mention this in this talk today, but from what we know, this is a lot of Laurie Santos's work, the tool use in non-human animals is not nearly as domain-specific as we all expected it to be. Okay, take the example of rooks, which I did talk about today. Rooks are a non-tool-using species. They don't use tools in the wild, right? And it turns out those non-tool-using corvids solve that trap tube task faster than chimps. And in fact, what's been very interesting about Laurie Santos's work and Clayton's work is that we're not finding a big difference in tool cognition sophistication between species that have natively used tools in the wild and species that don't. And that's very challenging to the idea that tool use is purely a domain-specific one. That's not to say that there's not biases built in. There clearly are. We clearly know that capuchin monkeys have biases. They have no exposure. We clearly know that you take a crow and without any experience with leaves and ever having seen a leaf before, the first thing it does when it sees a bark leaf is tries to use it to pick something up. So that's clearly nothing like a domain-driven system. But at the same time, the story's getting complicated, right? Because we're not finding what you'd expect. We're not finding that tool-using animals are more sophisticated than non-tool-using animals that causal reason as well. So,
yeah, just to follow up, I think that a lot of that comes from the fact that tools are defined in a really weird way in animal psychology. So birds' nests and beaver dams and such aren't counted as tools.
Yeah, right.
And there's just huge amounts of evidence that birds' nests, for example, are extremely modular and social learning plays no role whatsoever in even complicated things like reserves and such. Learning, I mean, the birds get better at building nests as they practice that, but even that seems to be, a relatively minor thing. So, I mean, tool use in the sense of using sticks or family sticks, right, using birds. And that could be because animals don't have hands, basically. There's very few animals that have the wherewithal to make much use of tools. But yeah, there's lots of artifacts that are highly designed and highly domain specific that birds and so on.
So that's why I deliberately use a picture of beaver as the example of animal.
Yeah, and there's variation from place to place. Beavers build different kinds of dams. They have open-ended rules.
But we don't see a lot of innovation in the engineering of beavers' nests in the last
No, because
years.
it's not, well, you know what I think, but, I mean, I don't have people figure out hardly anything. I mean, the argument I have with you is that you make causal reasoning. I mean, your story is as if everybody understands all these artifacts that we use. Even in a simple society, my belief would be people have hardly any understanding of most of the things that they use. And if they acquire knowledge about how to make a bow, or you had pygmies using bows. If you ask them why they make the bow that way and not all the other ways you can make a bow, why isn't it a compound bow? Why isn't it a composite bow? Why is it tiller this way and not that way? They'd say that's the way we make these bows. And so somebody had to figure it out, maybe, or maybe it's just, no, it doesn't have to be. It could be you just observe whose bows work better. And it's a purely social selective process. And that's an empirical question. And so, I mean, this is a kind of psychology picture of technological evolution. It emphasizes the cognitive part of it, and I think underemphasizes the social populational evolution.
In relation to your remark about looking at it as a neuroscientist, there was a recent paper describing the detection of a fairly large group of novel genes in the human neocortex and prefrontal cortex. So I don't know if some of this will eventually be answered on a molecular level.
Could be, and once in a while you hear news reports of special neural cells and mirror neurons with a fad 10 years ago, and perhaps one of those discoveries will one day be the answer. I just wait and see.
So there were several occasions in your talk where you stated that there was computational overlap between different problem domains, and it wasn't always exactly clear to me whether you were talking about the computational models that describe people's behaviors in those domains, or whether you were talking about actual neural cognitive computations that people are performing when they're solving these tasks.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't always clear to me whether you were talking about there's computational overlap in the models versus the instantiation.
Yeah, that's a good question. The argument is coming first out of the modeling, and then the question, the open question is it in fact true at the instantiation? We don't know that. That's an open question. I think there's good reasons from an analytic point of view to look at the kinds of problems being solved, and that we perceive there as being a fundamental similarity in some of the computations that involved. But that's still, as I put it up there, very much a hypothesis, right? So that hypothesis would drive experimental work at a neural level to see whether in fact that is in fact the case. And I think we were, as I mentioned, the limitation to that hypothesis is right now we don't have a good idea how we're doing that. And so until we get more, until we get better models at the representational level, it's be hard to figure out exactly whether that's true or not. Until we do more work at the neural level, physical level, we won't have, from my point of view, to knock down argument evidence one way or the other. But you're absolutely right to point to that as a limitation of the hypothesis. The hypothesis, the last hypothesis I put up there is certainly coming out of an analytic or a top-down philosophical, psychological argument, and saying if this is true, then this is what we should expect to see. But we haven't tested enough of what we should see to know whether the hypothesis is true. Sir?
So when you were talking about the common cause model with the rat study, and you were talking about how the light was present but it didn't come on, and they still acted as if they drew a diagnostic inference that food was there. What would that, if we did a study where you covered the light and they showed much improved differences or sensitivities than with the light not covered, and would that suggest then that they do show evidence for some aspect of diagnostic reasoning?
I don't think, I mean, you did that, didn't you?
I did a related study.
It's a related one, the Lessing's paper, right? Yeah, the absence of information. I mean, it shows that there's some sensitivity going on there, but it's not the rigorously logical marching backward up the causal chain story that maybe Waldman and Pat you had in that one.
But what alternative could it be then?
Well, that other evidence could be impinging on their sensitivities in various ways that would make it more or less novel or more or less familiar to them. So
familiarity.
But it's hard to explain when you can have a complete glaring lack of the common cause, that they still draw that same. So
people do that all the time.
Yeah, I know that's possible. That's possible. But your experiment there I thought was nice because it's actually consistent with everything else we see. We don't see evidence of diagnostic causal reasoning in any other experiment. So if you would show if the chimps were doing this elsewhere and then you showed that the rats weren't, then that would be anomalous, or the other way around. But in fact, your results are consistent with that. We don't see chimps noticing those kinds of backward reasoning events in any other. So, but right.
I have to say that I'm a little bit confused about who you are trying to argue against. For example, maybe it's like linguistic anthropology or cultural anthropology to make the picture really easy and fair, and you would be on the biological anthropology side. But you mentioned, is language the key? Yes, but not the only key.
Right.
But I think it's or you said the same thing for culture. Culture is the key, but not the only key.
That's right.
So I think it's a kind of unfair trial because I don't know who on the side of linguistic anthropology or cultural anthropologists would say that it's the only key. And I might have an idea about the solution of this kind of non-understanding of each other is that I think that your argument is like inside inner species analysis or cross-species analysis. I mean, to me, the fact that human and ape, there's a huge gap that completely makes sense. But then if I put like snail in the equation, then I would like look at ape and human beings are pretty close to each other. But my point was also that I think that you putting up like the groundbreaking work on the biological anthropology, and you said it, that's groundbreaking work, that's brand new information. But on the other side, I don't think you're taking like the best ideas and the best thesis on the linguistic anthropology or cultural anthropology side. I mean, it took a long time for you to point out the fact that a lot of people think that language and mind, or culture and language and biology go all together in a co-construction, co-evolution model. I mean, I don't think that this model is today, I think, really well known among linguistic and cultural anthropologists, was fairly represented in your opposition between biological anthropology and cultural anthropology.
I'm not trying to understand. So you're thinking that lots and lots of people actually buy into the co-evolutionary?
I don't think it's a lot, but I think that's the good ones. And on your side, you're not taking a lot of people. You're taking the good ones. And I think it would be a fair trial to take the good ones on the linguistic anthropology and cultural anthropology side, as well as you do for the biological anthropology, where you pick up like the groundbreaking good ones, and then you put them against, I mean, the kind of naive linguistic anthropology or naive cultural anthropology. And my last point would be that linguistic anthropology and cultural anthropology are basically inner species analysis, because it's so obvious, just like you said, and it's the kind of thing that, let's say that it's not only the result of culture and language, but cultural language, at least for people who are working on cultural language, that's the obvious fact we're working on. So we can't put that aside. And I mean, apes don't have language and culture the same way. I mean, cultural and linguistic anthropologists never argued that they have language or culture. For example, the term ritual is never used the same way by the cultural anthropologists. Cultural anthropologists use ritual for human beings the way some other people are using for animals. It's not the fact of cultural anthropologists. So they're not the one arguing that there is a link between humans and animals. I don't know if I made my point clear, but
I mean, if what you're saying is that cultural anthropologists are generally already closer to the camp I'm arguing for than all these other folks, then I think that's good news. Then is that what you're, if you're asking who's out there that argues for things like that language is the key, well, this is a good example. These are good books, right? And
yeah, but you said your point is valuable, especially if you think that language is the only clue or culture is the only key.
That's right.
I don't think, I haven't read all this book, but I won't pay attention to any book that is actually pretending something like language is the only clue.
I guess what I'm hearing is I'm preaching to the choir that we're already, and I should have aimed the talk within co-evolution. But you know, within the broader field of cognitive science, there is hardly agreement on those issues. These are very prominent, reasonable arguments here, and those people, you know, are very strongly on the language side. In the culture side, you know, we heard that Rob and I probably disagree about the importance of causal cognition in enabling human culture. And so among those folks that articulate the importance of culture in human evolution, there are still going to be a debate or differences about how important is causal reasoning in the evolution of human culture. So those are very real, reasonable debates. Those good science, right? It's just so it would be wonderful if everyone would agree with my last point. But I don't think that's the case.
Just to interject a clarification point here, I think that the subfield divisions that you've described are largely orthogonal to the debates that Derek is concerned with. Most of these debates all happen within some field that we might, an interdisciplinary field that we might describe as something like evolutionary behavioral science, right? And the questions and concerns within evolutionary behavioral science don't always map onto the questions and concerns across subfields within anthropology and even across disciplines at the university writ large. All of these people, as Derek has said, strongly adhere to an intellectual agenda of trying to make sense of the human mind in evolutionary terms, but there are radical disagreements within that larger sort of collective of individuals, and there are disagreements among individuals who, from a distance, are identical, right? So the difference between, from a distance, from the perspective of the difference between linguistic anthropology and biological anthropology, the difference between Pavanelli and Tomasello is indistinguishable, right? So this is about, a within the forest problem.
The Republican Party was, yeah, exactly. I just have a way of putting my whole point much more modestly, especially perhaps this kind of audience, or you, or people that generally agree, is that each one of these books has a theory about the evolution of the human mind none of these books mentioned a single word about tool use or causal cognition. Right? Or maybe they have a word, but there's almost nothing. The same thing occurs in these books, which are great books. Okay, these are great books, but let me pick on Jones since I'm going to make my case. That book is a great book on why there's a gap between human culture and social cognition. And it's got lots of great stuff in it. There's not a single mention of the role of causal cognition or tool use anywhere there. So I guess my modest claim today is to encourage everybody that's looking at these questions to consider the possibility that human causal cognition plays a role in what makes humans human.
There are two distinct things, and one is the study of extant species, and the other is constructing some plausible evolutionary path. And I think your work focused on the first one, right? But you mentioned the lack of plausibility of several different elements in the different setting, several different elements of the several differences between human minds and the minds of other species having appeared in 6 million years independently. In which way do you have a story, an evolutionary story, which is plausible? Since you're pointing out to such major differences, and we have only a period of 6 million years. One thing is what you observe, and there is no escape, right? You can dispute your analysis of that aspect, but when it considers the evolutionary path, what can you make up a plausible story?
Yeah, you're inviting me to tell a just so story, but that's fine. I think that I try to focus on, there's some popular stories out there that I'm trying to argue are less plausible. So I'm trying to argue that I suspect, shouldn't we all expect that the story is going to be a mess? Isn't this just what evolution always is? And when we put it in graphs, it looks simpler than it really is. There should be an n-dimensional picture, right? And it should be. So I think it's a mess, and so I don't think telling simple narratives is necessarily the answer to solve this. I guess one of the whole arguments I was trying to make is that the story that all these things evolve independently doesn't seem to me as plausible as the fact that either because of duplication or because of a single system, there are some key systems there that triggered that human great leap forward, if you will. And that key system underneath is not language, it's something beneath language, and it's not social cognition, and it's not even causal cognition, because all those things, as Claudia pointed out, all have lots of domain-specific adaptations and specializations that we wouldn't be able to have the causal cognition we have without a million other things that have nothing to do with cognition at all. But I think we need to consider a story that that the great leap forward, if you will, was triggered by some core computational cognitive mechanism that then enabled the others. That's the key thing. Now, how exactly that story was, I have no idea. This guy's first.
I think what you're pointing out, though, in terms of this multiple causes, even with causes flipping back on themselves, is something that's blocked by our human cognition. We evolved this ability to think in terms of linear causality, singular causality, and we keep falling back into that paradigm. It's really neat that you're pushing it into much more of a complexity view, but that's hard for humans to do. We saw last week, that we are essentialist thinkers as children, and we have all these things that probably had good survival value, but don't help us at all in understanding the world scientifically.
That's right.
Yeah, so following on John's point, because I agree with you, but I think that actually I agree with you about people wanting to think about single causes, but I think that's actually part of the problem that makes people think, well, I don't want to put too much in Derek's in his mouth on this, but in ways that probably aren't biologically realistic about what a system composed of lots of specialized subcomponents would be like. So, in this case, this right here looks like a massive modularity story to me. I would say that the massive modularity story is extremely complicated. It involves lots of interactions between parts. And everything on here, working memory is not the same as executive control, which is not the same as hand-eye coordination, so all those things are different, and that's what. The thing, though, you said something about how it's biologically plausible to imagine that
this thing was stuck on at the end, right? And then it would be in front of our brain, on the surface of the brain, that somehow, I don't see biologically why that needs to be true. So think about, for example, and a lot of people think that what a massive modularity story must be that there's lots of modules that are frozen in time, and then there's one that appears most recently that gets added on to all those ones that are frozen in time and that modifies what they do. There's no reason biologically why that needs to be the case. So if you think about, by metaphor, by analogy, a evolving modular system, the automobile, right? Nobody would deny that it's entirely composed of modules. There's nothing in a car that's not specialized, right? And you think about how it's changed from the origin of the automobile to the present. Every single component has evolved. There's not a single one that hasn't changed, and yet they're all specialized. Right? And so, when you look at what genomics is telling us about brain evolution, this is an empirical question, but I'll put money on it right now, that what we're going to see is that there's been a lot of genetic changes, small genetic changes that have influence in many, many places around the brain, not just one single area appeared and expanded with everything else staying the same, but rather that changes were occurring throughout the brain since the split between us and the chimpanzee common ancestor. So, I mean, and
I agree.
You may agree with that, but I mean, the
agree.
story that there's a special thing that appeared most recently and that it's on the surface of the brain, and I mean,
I think the surface argument is weak. It's only because we could expand it out.
There could be changes in the amygdala, right? There could be changes that affect our emotional relationships to other things that are deep in the brain that aren't on the surface. There's no reason biologically why it's more plausible that it has to be a cognitive thing smacked onto the top.
No, of course, but it does have some biological advantages. And by the way, I completely agree. I mean, there's nothing not massively modular about my little picture here or about my entire proposal. But there is a difference in granularity between the modules we're proposing and dependencies between the modules we're proposing. And I'm not saying, I don't know if anyone in this room holds to the massively modular strict form of it, but I know that some people do. I was in a public debate with Peter Crothers about this, and he really holds to the strict, and he flatly denies, and has denied it in press and in public, that there is any commonalities at all between those systems, right? So that's not a straw man. So my point is, it is massively modular, but there's going to be dependencies.
Yeah.
There's probably dependencies in there, and they aren't all separate silos.
That much it seems to me we should all agree on.
I think we should. Don't
Yes.
you think?
Yes.
Okay.
Good. So
Okay.
we solved something.
Wow. Very, very happy moment. I think we're out of time.